Welcome to Refugee Housing Solutions on-demand webinar focusing on which federal housing assistance programs non-citizens are eligible for. Hello, my name is Lynette Pearl, and I am the Senior Program Officer with Refugee Housing Solutions, a project of Church World Service under an agreement paid for by the U.S. Department of State. Before going into the webinar, I want to summarize who we are and what we offer. We are a technical assistance and capacity building support project for resettlement practitioners, housing providers, and community groups, including refugees and other newcomers to the United States. Our team partners with the mentioned stakeholders and with others, including government and private sector partners. Our partnerships aim to develop and implement innovative initiatives in order to increase housing availability and affordability for refugees and other newcomers. We offer trainings and create and share resources such as toolkits, fact sheets, and educational materials that are beneficial to those in the resettlement, housing, sponsorship, and volunteer space. We also provide individual and group TA sessions for resettlement practitioners, newcomers, landlords, sponsors, and volunteers. You can simply go to our website and use our booking system to schedule a session with one of our housing experts. So let's get started. The learning objectives for this webinar is for you to understand HUD's definition of a non-citizen and the housing programs non-citizens qualify for. You will also walk away knowing the difference between restricted and unrestricted housing programs and what housing assistance programs newcomers may qualify for under the umbrella of the continuum of care. Before discussing specific federal housing programs non-citizens may qualify for, we need to address the definition of a non-citizen and the eligibility requirements. According to HUD's definition, a non-citizen is a person who is neither a U.S. citizen nor a national of the United States. A non-citizen's eligibility for federal housing programs, it does vary. Eligibility is based on the specific program, the laws and regulations that govern it, and the agency that administers it. For example, HUD and IRS guidelines and requirements will differ. Other eligibility determinants are the non-citizen's immigration status and household composition. Now that we know how HUD defines a non-citizen, we can discuss what makes them eligible for specific federal housing assistance programs. Two primary laws directly address a non-citizen's eligibility for federal housing, which are Section 214 of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1980 and Title IV of the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996. Now, I am briefly going to go over Section 214 of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1980 because it oversees the specific housing programs I will cover in this webinar. Section 214 of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1980, it is an act that prohibits HUD from making financial assistance in certain HUD programs available to persons other than United States citizens, nationals, or certain categories of eligible non-citizens. This law established the first federal restrictions on non-citizens' eligibility for federal housing programs. The original restrictions were limited to non-immigrant students, but over time, the restrictions were expanded to additional categories of non-citizens. So you're probably thinking, what are those additional restrictions? And what is the meaning of the restriction and which is non-citizen is affected by it? With restricted programs, at least one person in the household must be either a U.S. citizen or an eligible non-citizen to qualify for the program. Restricted programs can have different documentation requirements, and the immigrant composition of a household can affect how much housing subsidy it receives in some restricted programs. Now, housing programs that allow anyone to apply if they meet the income guidelines, regardless of immigration status, are considered unrestricted. Now we know the difference between restricted and unrestricted. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail regarding some restricted program requirements. With restricted housing programs, the household may apply if one household member is a U.S. citizen or an eligible non-citizen. Now, the eligibility relies on a non-citizen status. The eligible person may not have to be the head of the household, depending on the housing program. Households that consist of eligible and non-eligible members are considered mixed households. Mixed households include members who do not have the appropriate immigration status to be eligible for that specific housing assistance program. I want to point out that with mixed households, HUD does prorate the assistance based on the number of eligible family members and not the total of number of people in the household. For example, if there is a household of 4 and only 2 of them are citizens or eligible non-citizens, the subsidy will be for a 2-person household instead of 4 because only 2 qualify. Before going into the specific restricted and unrestricted housing assistance programs, we need to know what affordability is and how subsidies are needed to make housing affordable for low-income newcomers. Affordable housing, defined by the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, known as HUD, is a dwelling where a family or household can obtain housing, whether through renting or purchasing, and will not spend more than 30% of their gross household income. FYI, gross income is income before taxes and deductions. So housing is affordable if an individual or family is not spending more than 30% of their gross income on rental or mortgage payments. So I'm an example type of person. So let's look at an example. We have Miss Newcomer. Her monthly income is $100 and she is seeking an affordable unit. Now, for Miss Newcomer to meet the affordability criteria based on HUD, her rent must be no more than $30 a month. Let's see how a subsidy comes into play with affordability. Now, if an individual family receives a subsidy, they will not pay more than 30% of their income towards the rent. So let's revisit Miss Newcomer. Her income is still $100 per month, and she currently lives in a Section 8 project-based unit, with her rent being $200 a month. Wait a minute. We determined in the first example that she can only afford $30 in monthly rent. So how is this possible? Well, it's possible because with her unit having a subsidy, she only pays 30%, which is $30, and the subsidy covers the remainder $170. So as you can see, without subsidies and subsidized housing, affordability can be out of reach for a lot of low-income families. Now, there are several restricted federal housing programs, but for this webinar, I'm going to cover some of the most common ones, which are public housing, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, formerly known as Section 8, subsidized project-based Section 8 rental assistance, USDA's 521 rural rental assistance, and Section 504 single-family direct loans and grant programs. So we're going to start with public housing. Public housing stock, they are properties owned by government authorities and funded through HUD, but administered by a local PHA and available for low-income families and individuals whose household income is less than 80% of the area's median income, which stands for AMI. Now, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, formerly known as Section 8, it too is like public housing. It is funded through HUD. It's administered by a local PHA and available for low-income families and individuals whose household income is less than 80% AMI. Now, the Housing Choice Voucher, it is the federal government's largest program that assists the elderly, disabled, and low-income families in securing housing in the private market. Since housing assistance is provided on the family's or individual's behalf, participants can find their own housing again in the private market. With the Housing Choice Program, the subsidy is paid directly to the approved landlord or housing provider by the housing authority on behalf of the participating family or individual. Now, I want to point out that landlords that participate in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, they do go through a process which requires them to pass a background check and the unit to pass an HQS inspection. Now, the participating household is still responsible for paying 30% of their income towards the rent. Another restricted program is project-based Section 8 housing. It is a government-funded program that provides rental housing to low-income households in privately owned and managed rental units. Now, with this program, the subsidy stays with the unit, unlike the Housing Choice Voucher program. Again, in this program, the subsidy is tied to the unit. I want to point that out because a lot of clients do get confused with the Section 8 project-based rental assistance with the Housing Choice Voucher program. So it's very important that if you have a client that is in a Section 8 project-based rental assistance and they decide they want to move, that you inform them that they will no longer have a subsidy because the subsidy is tied to the unit. Unlike the Housing Choice Voucher program, the subsidy is tied to the individual. Another restricted program is the USDA's 521 Rural Rental Assistance. Now, this is a project-based program that provides additional subsidies for tenants in Section 515 or 514 and 516 finance rental housing. Now, this assistance is for individuals and families, including the elderly and persons with disabilities with very low to extremely low incomes, which is 30% below AMI. Then you have Section 504, the Single Family Direct Loan and Grant Programs. It does provide loans to very low income homeowners to repair, improve, or modernize their homes, or it could be grants to elderly and very low income homeowners to remove health and safety hazards. Now, this chart shows the immigration categories and non-citizens who are eligible to apply for public housing, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, and project-based Section 8 rental assistant units. If you have any questions regarding this chart, feel free to contact us for a TA session. Now, we talked about restricted programs. We're going to talk about unrestricted. Now, as I stated earlier, with unrestricted programs, regardless of a client's immigration status, they may apply for these type of programs and do not have to provide documents or information regarding their immigration status. However, because these programs do not require citizenship documentation, applicants must still meet the program's income requirements and provide alternative documentation. Now, one of the largest unrestricted housing programs is the Low Income Housing Tax Credit, known as LIHTC. Now, this is a program where properties or an apartment complex is owned by a developer or landlord who participates in the federal Low Income Housing Tax Credit program. Now, developers and landlords receive tax credits by providing affordable housing to low-income tenants at a restricted rent amount. Now, to qualify for a unit, one must earn less than 60% AMI. There are income requirements depending on the set-aside unit and the number of members in the household. Another unrestricted possibility you can search for is check with your state housing finance agencies for additional housing assistance programs. Now, here is a snapshot. This will be provided for you. You can simply go to your respective state, click on that state, and you will get the contact information of how to get a hold of your state housing finance agency to see what unrestricted programs are available. Now, there are systems in place to address the needs of individuals experiencing homelessness. In one of HUD's largest unrestricted homeless assistance programs, they are available through HUD's Continuum of Care. Now, I want to let you know that I'm just going to give a summary of what the continuum of care is in the coordinated entry system. We do have an additional training that dives deeper into what the continuum of care is and how to get information regarding how to get in contact with your lead agency. So just FYI. So, according to HUD's regulations, a COC is a community plan to organize and deliver housing and services to meet the specific needs of homeless households as they move to stable housing. HUD states that all COCs must have four mandatory core parts, which are outreach, encompassing the intake and assessment process, emergency shelters, transitional housing, and permanent housing with support services. Now, as a resettlement staff member, you are constantly searching for resources that will enable you to house clients successfully. So, with this webinar, I'm going to focus on the first core elements of the COC, which is the outreach, intake, and assessment processes. Now, the first core tier is a starting point in getting your clients linked to housing assistance programs funded through your COC and facilitated by the coordinated entry system. Now, as I stated, HUD does require all COCs to establish a coordinated entry system. So the coordinated entry system, it is a process where the most vulnerable families or individuals are matched with appropriate resources and services in order to address their housing crisis. Now, an effective process, it is a critical component of any coordinated entry system in meeting the housing needs of that community. Because the coordinated entry system is specific to its community and housing needs, certain aspects of this system may be different. So it's very important that you connect with your local COC and lead agency to understand how the four core elements of accessibility, which is the access point, assessment, by name list, and the referral are executed. So your question is, how does a household get started, or how do I get a client started? Well, the first step is access. The access is the first engagement point for individuals and families experiencing a housing crisis. The access point does look and function differently in each community. So, for example, some communities might require an individual to call 211, contact United Way, an access center, or an access point. Now, the access point is used as an initial screening process to determine if a household is eligible for services. Now, as I stated earlier, each community service is different. Like, for example, I am located in Kansas City. Our COC offers diversion services during pre-screening. And if the household is determined eligible for services after the pre-screening, they then will be assessed. Now, in a research-based questionnaire during the assessment, what it does, it ranks the household vulnerability based on the participant's age, health, and other factors. Now, the assessment that not only determines vulnerability, but also housing eligibility and level. In the by name list stage, the coordinated entry system uses the assessment data to compare the household's level of need with those assessed for housing and supportive services. So the good thing about this process, if you get your client to the access point, and if they're eligible for services, then they will go on to the assessment. So once the assessment is completed, the household is placed on the by name list. Again, I want to point out that each community's terminology is different. Some communities call it a prioritization list, and others may call it a community housing list, or as I mentioned, a by name list. So for this training, I'm going to be referring it to as the by name list. So the by name list helps the coordinate entry system manage its inventory of resources and services. ensuring that the household with the greatest need and vulnerability receive the support they need to resolve their housing crisis. Now, once an opening is available with a grantee that meets that household needs and the program requirements, they then are referred out for services. So if you have an actual newcomer client, they get assessed through the COC, they qualify for services, and they're put on the by name list. They will be on that list until there is an actual match with a grantee, and then they're going to be referred out to services. So I want to kind of give a summary of how the COC workflow is. So you have HUD. HUD does provide the funding, the direct funding. Then you have the COC lead agency. The COC lead agency, they oversee the funding requirements and they monitor the grantee's performance and they submit reports and grant performances to HUD. Then you have the coordinated entry system. They're kind of like the arms and legs of the system. They oversee the access point, the assessment of clients, and manage the by name list, and they do the referrals out. Then you have the grantee, and the grantees, they are responsible to follow the NOFA and the COC policies and procedures and provide the direct services. We're going to go ahead and go into what COC funding programs that are available. There are several programs and outreach components, but for this webinar, I'm going to focus on the most common programs newcomers could possibly qualify for, which is rapid rehousing, transitional housing, and homeless prevention. Now, with rapid rehousing, it does provide short-term rental assistance and services. The goal is to help people obtain housing quickly to increase self-sufficiency. With rapid rehousing, there are no preconditions. That's why newcomers could possibly qualify for this funding if they're experiencing a homeless crisis. Again, there's no preconditions. The rapid rehousing, it does typically last for 24 months of funding. Again, it depends on funding availability. With this actual program, after several months of being in this program, the subsidy amount is gradually reduced in increments in a way that supports the individual or family while getting them back on their feet. Another program a newcomer could possibly qualify for under the COC is transitional housing. This provides temporary housing with support services to individuals and families that are experiencing homelessness, with the goal of interim stability and support to successfully move them to permanent housing. Now, with transitional housing, it can cover housing costs up to 24 months. Again, funding availability will determine how much they will receive if they qualify for this program. Another is homeless prevention. It does provide short-term or medium-term rental assistance and housing relocation and stabilization services. Now, with homeless prevention dollars, the funding aims to prevent an individual or family from becoming homeless. Again, it depends on your COC if they have this funding. COCs that have homeless prevention dollars are high performers. And again, the NOFA will outline what the homeless prevention dollars can be used for. For example, I'm in Kansas City. Our COC does have homeless prevention dollars. I have seen those dollars be used for rental assistance, rental arrears, security deposits, and for soft touch case management as well. That's why it's so important that you connect with your lead agency to see what is available in your geographic area. Well, this concludes this webinar. If you have any questions or need further assistance regarding future trainings or technical assistance, you can email me at lpearl@cwsglobal.org, or you can schedule a session through our booking system. Thank you all for viewing RHS On Demand webinar, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.